Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, buonasera, and welcome to the virtual space of the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Chicago for the second of the 6 talks by Dr. Giovanni Aloi dedicated to the history of Italian photography from the origins of the medium to present time. I would like to warmly welcome and thank Dr. Aloi, who's an art historian specialized in the history and theory of photography and of the representation of nature in art, and currently lecturer at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York and London. Following the first talk that focused on the birth of photography and its relationship to painting, we approach today the role that photography gained during the second half of the 18th century, both on an individual and on a collective level. And we will as well get acquainted with the artistic practice, vision, and personality of Virginia Olduini, Countess of Castellione. I remind you as usual that the webinar is recorded, it's being recorded. We are live on Facebook tonight, and you can type your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So now I would like to leave the floor and the screen to Dr. Aloi. Please, Giovanni.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here, Luca. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this series. And it's been so much fun to research and present so far. So I'm just going to share my screen. Tonight is particularly exciting because we're going to cover a lot more in terms of different subjects and also a variety of photographers that have really changed the history of the medium over time. So just a reminder before we begin about the next dates. We're looking at Dynamism and Ideology and Power on the 15th of April, and the Contemporary Italian Photography focus for the 13th of May. And just a little recap of what we explored last week so that we're all on the same page. What is a photograph was our leading question. We looked at the history of the medium as a continuation of a dream, as I explained, as I contextualized in our last exploration. And a dream that, of course, I tied back to the history of painting during the Middle Ages and the rise of realism in the history of representation itself. One of the important aspects of this desire to heighten realism and to represent realism with the accuracy that we find during the Renaissance was linked to power and to money as well as religion. And it's in the context of this rise of realism that we explore the importance of the camera obscura. The camera obscura being the invention that we can consider as the grandmother of the photographic camera, was used by artists to represent reality with the uttermost level of accuracy. We saw how Caravaggio was most likely using the camera obscura so that he could paint without even outlining the subject onto the canvas. And we looked at how Canaletto, among others, was an artist who engaged with the representation of beautiful vistas of Venice through the camera obscura for commercial reasons. For Canaletto, it was faster to use the camera obscura. Then we looked at the beginning of photography proper, the rise of the medium that begins in 1826 with the first photograph ever taken. We also noticed how it was a relatively messy and grainy business, but it wasn't long before the launch of the daguerreotype in 1836 enabled photographers to capture landmarks and landscapes. We mentioned at the very beginning of the last talk how ultimately photography came about with limitations. So the limitations that photography entailed had to do with exposure times, especially. Of course, photography was black and white at this time, but exposure times meant that photographers were mainly and sometimes only able to capture static objects. And static objects, of course, like still life, gathering of objects on tables, as well as cityscapes and landscapes. We also began to lay the foundations of a very important concept, the concept of identity. What can photography do is the question we're going to explore today, based on the foundations laid last week. You will remember the Caffè Greco in Roma, where many photographers, artists, and intellectuals of the time would gather to talk about how the new medium could change the course of history. And in fact, it did do just that. This is one of the images I showed you last week that remind us of the beautiful project that Ruskin carried out in Venice, again, pioneering the potential of what photography can do for the history of architecture, but also the history of culture. And we also explored the relationship between painting and photography and how the notion of an Italy stuck into the past began to play out and how that becomes problematic for photography in Italy and for Italy itself in terms of identity thereafter. So here is a question: what does a photograph do? Well, a photograph can do a lot. And today we're going to explore mainly how photography partakes in the construction of identity, how it inserts itself in our memories of ourselves and others, how it can lie about reality. I'll show you a few examples that will make you rethink the emphasis we place on fake news today when we think that fake news is a relatively new invention. We will look at how it can promote political ideals and also how it began to influence painting. So before we look at all these interesting propositions more in detail, I'd like to begin with an experiment. It's a pity we're not in the same room, but it can still work and it can be fun. Close your eyes and think about a holiday you took, most likely before the pandemic. Anything that dates back to the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, even older. If you close your eyes and for a few seconds, summon an image from that holiday. Do it now. Okay, give you a few seconds. Can you confidently say that what you summoned in your mind was the image of a real experience you lived during that holiday, or that it wasn't a photograph you have taken during that holiday that you have looked at over and over after it was all over? Ha! That is one of the most fascinating aspects of photography, and one of the reasons why photography truly changes the way in which we live and the way in which we think and experience the world. Because it insinuates itself in our minds in ways that we can no longer untangle. It becomes impossible at times to remember if what we remember is a photograph or it was a lived experience. So, how do we negotiate these challenges? Well, most often we just don't, which is when we allow photography to construct the world for us, and we allow photography to ultimately define who we are in ways that we sometimes lose track of. And I'm going to show you a very interesting case in a few slides, but before we get there, I wanted to let you know about this invention that problematized this idea of memory through photography. This is an example of stereographic photography or stereoscopic photography. What is stereoscopic photography? A fabulous invention for 19th century in which people didn't have TV screens, computers, cinema screens, all of that. So just imagine a world that it's so much more simple when it comes to the consumption of images. And this thing comes along. Photography had already turned the world upside down when it came to the notion of reinventing the visual world. But stereoscopic photography added an extra gear. So we're in the 1850s, 1860s, and stereoscopic photography allows three-dimensional images to be seen for the first time ever. You've all been to 3D movies at some point. You know how strong the effect of a 3D image can be. Just imagine somebody from the 19th century experiencing the strength of a 3D image. Well, how would it happen, and why are there two images next to each other on the same card? Because in order to enjoy stereoscopic photography, you needed a visor. The visor, as you can see here, is a really interesting tool with two lenses which can be regulated. And it's through the regulation of the image itself, the distance between the lenses and the image, that you can accomplish the most realistic three-dimensionality that has ever been accomplished at the time. And think about what we just did, our experiment, where we explore how photography insinuates itself in our minds, and it's difficult to go back and identify which is a photograph, which is the lived experience. Imagine experiencing photography three-dimensionally, how that plays on people's minds in the 19th century. Even if it's black and white, the three-dimensionality adds to that game. And a lot of these stereoscopic cards were hand-painted, which means that ultimately they would create a three-dimensional illusion of reality. So it's an interesting chapter in the history of photography, but it's also a very interesting chapter in the history of Italian photography. We saw last month, how the idea of photographing Italy, capturing the beauty of the landmarks, was so strong that it drove many from the rest of Europe to gather in Italy and document. So Italy was one of the most regularly photographed 3D examples in the history of early photography, and for good reasons. If you couldn't travel to Italy and experience these landmarks directly, 3D photography really changed that for you and gave you the impression of having been there. Curiosity, 3D photography became a hit when Queen Victoria became a fan of three-dimensional stereoscopic photography. And of course, the rest of the world followed. It became a massive hit across Europe and then the United States. But here's the most important, perhaps, case study of today. An incredible Italian pioneer that's been overlooked time and time again by the historians of photography and also art historians in general. Who is she? Known as the Contessa di Castellione. She was born in La Spezia in Liguria, and her name is so long that I have to read it for you. She was called Virginia, Elisabetta, Luisa, Carlotta, Antonietta, Teresa Maria, Oldoini. Quite a few people in that one name, right? And according to herself and to the records, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Isn't that a title? Well, why is she famous now, and why was she a protagonist of photography during the 19th century? Well, let's say that the artistic upbringing of Virginia Oldoini was pretty much part of a plan to keep her safe. Her father sent her to the Orsoline, which is an order of nuns that very much valued artistic education. And that was a way to keep her from men. She attracted a lot of male attention. And that's where she had the opportunity to study art, which is something that she really capitalized upon when she moved to Paris. She moved to Paris in 1855, and she didn't move there just because she wanted to be part of Parisian society. She was actually sent there by Camillo, Count of Cavour, her cousin. And she was sent there on a mission. The mission was to seduce none the less than Napoleon III in order to grant a smoother alliance between the fragmented Italy and France. And it worked. Apparently, the Contessa Di Castillone became the official lover of Napoleon III for a year, and she became the envy of all Parisian women. She's an incredible character, as far as we know, extremely determined and in charge. This is the most famous photograph that she took. As you can see, she holds what is a frame of a daguerreotype. So that's a very strong image because you see her own eye looking through the photographic frame. She had a very heightened sense of what photography could accomplish. And the idea especially that photography is not just a medium through which to represent reality, which is mostly what had been done before her time, but that it is a medium through which you can actually engineer reality. You can construct identity, and you can create a portrait of yourself that is important and that will change people's conception of who you are. So how did the Countess of Castellione invent herself? I just wanted to play you a few of the 400 images that she took at the time in collaboration with Pierre-Louis Pierson, who was a very well-known photographer in Paris and who worked with her on these images that to us today might look relatively simple, but to people at the time looked absolutely incredible. You have to remember that the photographic processing was slower and much more expensive. But what is incredibly fascinating about the Countess of Castiglione is the way in which she posed, the way in which she designed the scenes for each photograph, the way in which she directed Pierson, maintaining control over each character she impersonated, the fashion, and the decor. And oftentimes, like in this case, even guiding the photographer to capture the human body like it had never been done before. Some art historians have noticed that her approach to photography anticipates surrealism at times, and that at others, she was already ahead of her time with a sophisticated understanding of what it means to flirt with the camera or to tease the camera. So she really embodied this presence that was particularly strong and particularly powerful at a time in which people were still trying to understand what photography is for. Not only she posed as characters, as you can see here, there's a sense of drama, there's a sense of theatricality that was very much ahead of its time. But so not only she embodies characters from literature, history, and mythology, but she also uses photography to restage key moments of her life. And as you can imagine, the key moments of her life, since she was a socialite of the time, involved wearing particularly sumptuous and sophisticated gowns. So after she'd wear a beautiful dress in public, she would then return to Pearson and stage a photograph in which she could be remembered for that specific character she embodied that night. So 400 images that make up an incredible collection. Unfortunately, as it seems, according to the letters that the Countess of Castellione left behind, she had a conflictual relationship with her beauty after a certain point in life, and growing older was not easy for the Countess. Apparently, she got rid of all the mirrors in her home at some point once she neared the age of 50, and surrounded herself with these beautiful photographs just to remind her days of glory. She unfortunately also ended her life in a bit of a lonely state because she wasn't women's best companion. Apparently, she wasn't talking to other women at all, and therefore remained mostly isolated as time went by. So a bit of a tragic character in essence. Died in 1899, and she was actually planning the last masterstroke of her life. She wanted to gather all 400 images taken by Pearson in an exhibition for the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. The exhibition should have had the title, The Most Beautiful Woman of the Century, but unfortunately it never happened because she passed away in 1899. She's certainly an incredible pioneer in the history of photography, and one that I very much invite you to research further in your own time. Now, moving on from the Countess of Castellione, but not quite as swiftly, you may have noticed that in some of these images, her waistline looked particularly narrow. And that's not just because she was in beautiful shape as a woman, but because of some retouching. Again, we think about Photoshop and all the retouching we see today in magazines and newspapers and online. We can't trust any photograph of anybody, but that began in the 19th century. You can see here a lady in charge of retouching a glass plate. Now, it was common to draw, scratch, and apply paint on glass plates and then print a photograph. You can see a detail here where a lady is working on a negative. You could correct a great deal of detail with this type of images. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image that's not being retouched, and the retouched version on the right. You can see how the retouching process aimed at smoothing the quality of the skin, adjusting the lighting to create a more kind of rounded effect, and generally just beautifying the subjects. It's pretty much what we see today with Photoshop. Again, here on the right-hand side, you have the original photograph, which has been retouched on the left-hand side, and you can see the little adjustments even made to the dress to just create a beautiful balance in the image itself, but also some traits considered at the time less desirable, as the unevenness in the skin tone were corrected, and overall a youthful appearance was granted. You can see here this picture from a certain distance looks pretty normal, as in no tampering has happened to it, but when you zoom in, you can actually see that a lot of pretty rough scratching has happened around the nose to reduce its size, and this dotting on the face, it's basically a way in which the overall appearance of the skin could be smoothed. And you can see here, I was talking about very narrow waistlines. You can clearly see here that something must have happened because this waistline is excessively narrow, despite the fact that women during the 19th century did apply a lot of pressure with specific items of garments to restrict and narrow the waistline. This is a little bit beyond the possible. And you can see here, looking more carefully, that this section of the photograph was basically painted over in order to generate a narrow waist. So from retouching of photography, which also has an impact on identity, you're all familiar with those filters and tools you can use on Instagram to give yourself a bit of a brush up before you post, to another form of realism. So a lot of what we see during the 19th century in Italy, and of course by extension everywhere in Europe, but in Italy especially, is the birth of a realistic approach to photography. And again, when we say realism and photography, it's kind of complicated, because by the simple action, the simple act of framing a subject, you already edit reality consistently. But of course, there are things photographers can do which can make things more complicated. For instance, Giacomo Caneva was one of the early pioneers of Italian photography who posed people for the purpose of creating these portraits that are generic. These are not necessarily portraits of people that paid to be photographed, like in the case of the Countess of Castellione. But as you can see here, they begin to compose a sense of Italian national identity. In this case, based on traditional costumes and clothing. So you can see here this child with a basket and a doll in it. Not quite clear how the photograph came to be, but it is claimed that Caneva used to hang around the Piazza di Spagna steps and recruit these characters, take them to his studio, and pose them according to his desire. So you can see here another example. There's a certain level of theatricality in the images by Caneva, but you can see also how they're very far away from what the Countess of Castellione was trying to accomplish. In this case, Caneva is really trying to capitalize on an idea of Italian identity based on regional notions of folkloric fashion as well as activities. Like you can see here, this woman is a filatrice, which means that she used to work with wool. And Caneva pushes his art from these simple compositions and tableaux to more complex tableaux that he actually becomes familiar with from Britain. In Britain, the tableau was particularly popular in photography, and it represented an opportunity to create scenes that could not otherwise be captured in reality. Like you can see here in the Estrema Unzione tableau, which is basically the moment in which the person we see in the middle of the image, which is passing away, receives the blessing. And these sort of situations were particularly complicated to photograph. Believe it or not, the Estrema Unzione was commonly painted as a subject, but photography was deemed vulgar at the time in the context of these fragile moments in life, and therefore it was very hard for photographers to measure up to painting in the context of death. Therefore, it was easier to restage the moment, as you can see here, by Giacomo Caneva. But there's also another reason why these images are structured and staged in the way we see now in this example. It's because of the necessary lighting and control of lighting that was required to produce images that were legible and clear enough. This sort of lighting would have not been possible to recreate in an environment outside photographic studios at the time. And as we move towards this idea of identity and how photography begins to construct an Italian identity, from the personal identity of the Countess of Castiglione to the national identity that we see emerging from the images by Caneva, it is time to talk about revolutions and war. So you will remember the French Revolution and, of course, the Spring Revolution of 1848. The French Revolution unsettled the working classes and the lower strata of society, emboldening the idea that changing the system is possible. And it's the revolutions of 1848 that will effectively accomplish what hadn't been accomplished across Europe in the follow-up of the French Revolution. So in Italy, the key moment of unification is called Risorgimento. The Risorgimento means the rebirth, and it's the rebirth of Italy's past glories as a unity. It begins in 1848 with the insurrections that begin from Sicily and move their way up across Europe, and it ends in 1861 with the unification of Italy. This is what Italy looked like at the time. And you can see that we are faced with a complex fragmentation of states. You can see here the Kingdom of Sardinia. It's incorporating Sardinia and what we recognize today as Piedmont. You have the Kingdom of Lombardy and Veneto right up here. And you have a very extended Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, incorporating Sicily and most of the south of Italy. The big problem is the Papal State in the middle of it all. And as we will see, it will become problematic to declare true unity of Italy until Rome and Venice, who had not been annexed in 1861, are incorporated. You will see also how photography plays a role in that context. Now, Stefano Lecchi is one of the most interesting photographers of this time, and it is claimed the first one, even before others in Europe, to create the first war portfolio, with 41 photographs that were only found recently during the 1990s. These events that are documented by Stefano Lecchi are part of the Roman Republic, which was a 5 months long republic, part of the early insurrection moment in the Risorgimento, and which unfortunately was brought down by the French right away. These images are particularly fascinating because not only they are the first war reportage that we know about in Europe, but also because it apparently started entirely because of Lecchi's desire to document the destruction of the war. It is not commissioned for economic reasons, and it's not commissioned by any factions in the specifics, so that it doesn't represent, let's say, a particular point of view. But these images apparently were particularly interesting in the context of the Risorgimento, partly as document, but partly also as breaking down the ideas that we explored last month. So the idea of an Italy that is caught up in the past, the idea of an Italy that's about ruins that belong to a time that's very far away, like the Roman Empire. In this case, we have a new generation of ruins that are being created by Italian photography, which are not part of the repertoire of Piranesi, which speak about Italy today. I'm sure many of you can understand how this is really the beginning of emancipation and the rise of an Italian identity that is different from what Italy had to contend priorly. And there is something interesting about photography and how photography begins to influence painting. Those of you who are strong in the history of Impressionism will remember that by 1874, when Monet launches Impressionism, photography had become really influential, and some artists were particularly concerned with the idea that photography might put them out of work. But what is fascinating is that Italy responded to photography perhaps even sooner than Impressionism in Paris, with this movement of artists, the Macchiaioli. Who were the Macchiaioli? Well, here they are. I won't read you all the names, but you can take a screen grab if you want to find out more about them. They were artists who were inspired by French painting, but not by Impressionism. They were inspired by realism, the movement that changed the history of representation by incorporating subjects like peasants as well as lower working classes that had been excluded from representation before. So you can see how the inspiration of the Macchiaioli is in line with the conversation, with the historical and political conversations of Italy at the time. They are called Macchiaioli from the Italian word macchia, which means stain. And this is because, as you can see here in some of the paintings, we really seem to be confronted by color fields that look as if they are stains. They look as if they are almost abstracted marks onto the canvas. So the Macchiaioli are a realist movement in essence. They paint soldiers, they paint the reality of Italy at the time, as you can see in these beautiful images. They're able to charge the everyday life images they capture with a poetic sense that emphasizes a desire for a national identity to emerge. But they also are very much at the vanguard of the use of photography in order to capture this sense of everyday poetics. So you can see here this painting by Luigi Gioli, and you can see here the photograph from which the painting derives. Here they are right next to each other, and you can see that Gioli looked at the photograph very carefully and reproduced it with incredible accuracy in order to make his painting. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that photography is changing the way in which painting is also representing the world. Suddenly, artists have a new tool at their disposal and they can use it to capture reality in ways that are fresher, less posed, and a lot more in line with the idea of painting everyday life. However, at this time, many artists will prefer to keep the use of photography secret because photography was seen as a tool and as a lesser art form, even by those who understood that photography could be seen as an art form. There was a bit of a stigma that photography, it's too easy, it's too simple. It seemed to people that it happens at the click of a button, while painting required a lot of skill instead. So those who use photography tend to keep it a secret so that their artistic skills are not devalued. How does photography impact the emergence of national identity in the context of historic events? Well, we just saw earlier how the documentation of the Roman Republic is really important in order to document and evidence the events. The events are happening for real, and this is what they look like. There's that terrible cliche that a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. I always cringe when I hear that. But in the context of the 19th century, it is true, especially when you think about a world in which photography and photographs in general were very hard to come by. But other images too were not evidence of anything. A painting of a battle could just be made without the battle having ever happened. Photography carried with itself this tangible evidence, this idea that something exists and something has actually happened and you can see it. That's why it is important, especially in the context of history and politics. So Garibaldi is, of course, one of the most photographed official men of the time. And what I'm showing you here is called a carte de visite. What is a carte de visite? Well, a carte de visite is a photograph that's portable, a little bit like a business card. That's the size of these portable images that usually had a photograph on one side and then the name of the person on the other, or some information as they pleased to disclose about them, sometimes an address. If you're thinking, are they like business cards? Yes and no. People love to have them and people love to collect them. There's something fascinating about the 19th century and this desire to own photography that is portable, that you can build a collection of your friends, their carte de visite, and look at them in your own time. Something tangible about them when they're not with you. But photography at this time plays a very important role in the history and documentation of critical events, like the one represented here in this anonymous photograph. As you can imagine, many of the images taken during the 19th century were anonymous because those who took pictures not always recognized the value of what they were bringing to the history of representation itself. This is the expedition of the 1,000, as it is known in Italy, and it was a very daring and courageous mission led by Garibaldi, who recruited roughly 1,090 men to depart from Genova and to arrive in Sicily in order to conquer the kingdom of the two Sicilies. And for as unlikely as the mission seemed, it worked, and it was a massive success. So of course, this is not all 1,000 of the men that were recruited, but there is another very important document that you can see here. This is the Album dei Mille by Pavia. Now, this album is one of the very earliest to be created and to have been put together over a quite lengthy period of time. It started, the event took place in 1860, and Pavia started to document it in 1863. As you can see here, is very ornamented. Photography lent itself to this kind of incorporation. But this is what pages later on in the book look like. And you can see how the carte de visite that were created are different in style. These are almost all of the participants. So it's really like a big memento and souvenir of the event. And of course, after the event itself, Pavia couldn't travel around Italy to find all of the soldiers that helped Garibaldi, and therefore commissioned local photographers to take pictures on his behalf and to send them back to him. That's why some, as you can see, have a very different style and pose and organization, because local photographers would just act independently at time when it came to these aesthetic choices. But the 1860 and 1861, which is the key date of the unification in Italy, as you will see, becomes historic for a number of reasons. So 1861, Italy is unified, and again, photography begins to play some strange tricks. Like in this image of Garibaldi that we see here, that allegedly was taken in 1862 on Aspromonte. I know many of you are familiar with Aspromonte, but it's a massive mountain on the tip of Calabria in the south. This is where, during a battle, Garibaldi's wounded at his foot, and you can see the wound here. It might look a little conspicuous and strange that a sign saying Aspromonte 1862 has been placed next to Garibaldi just to emphasize the veridicity of the event. We know the event took place, but we now also know that this is not Garibaldi at all, but it's a lookalike that was set up a few years later, which might actually explain why this sign is put here so prominently to validate the image that it's clearly fake. So these kind of images are important because even though they are fake, you can imagine that during the 19th century, it was even more impossible than it is today to understand what was real news and what wasn't. Even today, Twitter seems to struggle with the fact checkers, right? So in the 19th century, for these images to infiltrate different networks of information like newspapers, and they would just get reproduced over and over and over as reality. Another extreme case of fake news is this image, which is even more important to the history of the unification of Italy and dates back to 1870. You will remember that I mentioned earlier that Rome and Venice had to be conquered separately. And it took 9 years for that to happen in order to unify Italy completely. The Breccia di Portapia is one of the most defining moments in this history of unification that follows 1861. Now, this is Portapia, as you can see here, but there is no Breccia, which is the passage open through the walls at Portapia. This is the door itself, the porta. So what happened here? Well, Gioacchino Altobelli was a photographer, professional photographer, well known, and he was commissioned to take the official image commemorating the Breccia di Portapia. And he had no choice, since he was not at the event, but to stage it 2 or 3 days after. So you can see here that he positioned his soldiers. They're all like pretending to be on alert while they're really just posing. And the image appeared on all newspapers at the time as the truth. Of course, news, circulated slowly in comparison to today. And this image reveals the event and the difference. So you can see here, this is the porta that we just looked at. I can show it to you again. You can see the soldiers are right outside. And instead, this is where they entered the city, which is just, further down the road. Why was the image faked? Why couldn't the photographer take his soldiers here and recreate a fake that at least was closer to reality? Well, that's part of the rhetoric, isn't it? A picture like this looks so much more dramatic and so much more, it's what was needed at the time in order to move the ideals forward and to make people gain this notion of greatness, of how heroic the unification of Italy was. What's fascinating is that not only this image is fake and was circulated as real, there was another fake image that was created by somebody else, an anonymous person, who thought there weren't enough soldiers. And so here they are, multiplied from the same image. You can see, again, I can show you the original fake, the fake, the double fake. What's even more funny is that to add drama, this person used the same soldiers head down here, here, and here to create some dead bodies. Well, that just kind of heightens the drama, and also added a few cannon holes on the wall itself, as you can see here, emphasizing them to make sure the drama is heightened. So this is considered to be the first official piece of fake news of modern days in Italy. And returning to 1861, not only was a very important year for the unification of Italy, but it was also a very important year for the history of photography and consequently for the history of the world, because color photography was invented. Here's the first color photograph ever taken. It was taken by James Clerk Maxwell, and it was created by photographing the subject, which is a tartan ribbon, through red, blue, and yellow filters that were then overlaid in order to recreate the coloration. Now, this way of producing color was used extensively throughout the first 50 years of the last century, and it proves revolutionary. So in Italy, we find the use of photography and color, as you can see here, becoming essential for the representation and more realistic representations of big cities. The colors look a little fake, right? They're a little bit forced because, of course, they are created by filters. They're not actually naturally obtained. You can see some effects here that are better results. And again, here with this newsagents, where the coloring looks just a little bit forced, but nonetheless more naturalistic. So this is the beginning of something different. Black and white was the official language of photography, and until color photography was invented, painters felt they had an extra gear that they could still continue to do what they did in one way or another. But when photography acquired color, that's when it really started to pose a threat to painting. And when it comes to photography in Italy, we can't not acknowledge the enormous accomplishment of the Fratelli Alinari. The Fratelli Alinari are pretty much single-handedly responsible for elevating photography in Italy to an art form because of the sophistication of their work, but to also systematize photography. They built the first photographic establishment with the acknowledgement that photography must be collected, that photography is not just this fleeting, ephemeral documentation, but that it's history. So the Alinari archive today counts more than 5 million images, and it is considered to be one of the most important photographic archives in the world. The Fratelli Alinari had a good sense of professionalism when it came to elevating photography and to identify what applications might work well for photography. When we look at this image here, as you can see, one of the things I still find fascinating about the 19th century is how people used to be elegant most of the time. Those who could afford it, of course, even when they were working in an environment like this, like in a darkroom. This is obviously a staged photograph of some kind because the window is open and we see one of the Alinari brothers here working in the tray, shaking a photograph. But if you look at the ones that are drying here on the left-hand side, you can see that these are all works of art, and that is no coincidence. We're going to return to this in a second. Look at this. This is the atelier of the Alinari brothers. Isn't this gorgeous? You can see how they really understood the importance of lighting. There's obviously skylights and glass roofs to allow as much natural lighting as possible to filter in, and beautiful sceneries that could work as a backdrop for those who wanted their images taken. They were the absolute top of the photographic art in Italy. And as you can see here, they employed lots of technicians to really maintain their quality standard across production. So they were really systematizing photographic professional standards. And we talked about art. And you know, now you all want your art history books to have photographs. But if you remember, the first art history book ever made was by Giorgio Vasari in the Renaissance. And that didn't have photographs. So Giorgio Vasari had to think proactively about how to make his book of history of art seductive. And he decided that biographies was the way to go because people like to read biographies of everybody, gossips, events, anecdotes. But with the invention of photography, for the first time, works of art can be replicated, and it changes the history of art history. The Alinari brothers are at the forefront of this change. And you can see here this beautiful Moses by Michelangelo, or this detail from the Sistine Chapel. Now, think about this. What did the Alinari accomplish by photographing the most important art historical landmarks in Italy? Well, first of all, they made art accessible. Not everyone could travel to these landmarks and enjoy them in person. But at the same time, they made it possible for art historians and researchers to see details that they could not normally see. I'm sure many of you have been to the Sistine Chapel, and you can probably remember that when you look up, it's kind of far, right? The ceiling is pretty high, which means that you're not going to be able to see as many details as you hoped. The overall impression is glorious, but you can probably gain a better experience of details of the Sistine Chapel through photographic reproduction than you can do in person. So this annoyed some people. It annoyed some art historians and some connoisseurs who felt that this type of reproduction is nonetheless diminishing art. Not only because it's reproducing art in black and white, but also because it puts a painting or a fresco or a sculpture on the page of a book. Today, we wouldn't think twice. I'm sure your homes are filled with beautiful art books, with incredible pictures. And actually, the ones dating prior to the 1960s and 70s, which don't have color photographs, have now become obsolete. They have a different kind of charm, but they're certainly not the kind of photographic impact that we expect today. So there was this interesting debate on whether it was fair to even photograph art. One of the detractors of photography drew this parallel. They said to look at art in a photograph is the same as looking at a sunset reflected in a bucket filled with water. Pretty elitist it is, but nonetheless, I can see what they were trying to understand and what they were trying to come to grips with. There are some critics today that claim that Instagram cheapens our relationship with art when artists upload images on Instagram, because it's not the way in which the art was meant to be consumed. So I guess you're really on a slippery slope at that point, where you're arguing perhaps a pointless question of purism. And of course, the Fratelli Alinari also became leaders in the monopoly of images of Italian landmarks involving architecture. What we saw earlier that was being pioneered by other foreign photographers becomes the domain of the Fratelli Alinari, who can also keep the quality so high and so constant that just blow away any competition. The archive of the Alinari Brothers is also particularly noticeable because of the images of animals and nature they incorporated. You can see here this horse and a dog in this image. There's a desire to represent the animal, the domestic animal in this case, or the farm animal, in a way that perhaps is more akin to documentation rather than dramatization. You know, clearly the animal is kept at bay. But remember, it's 1870 in this case, and this is a moment in which photography has improved enough from a technical standpoint that it allows photographers to capture animals. Animals have the tendency to move. Very few animals stand still too long, and it took time for exposure to be reduced so that an image could be captured much faster. This is the result. You can see the Alinari brothers really excel in the capturing of animals because of the lighting. They have great control of lighting and ways in which to capture the animal at their best. But they also captured very unorthodox and unusual images like this one, in which you can see the director of the Aquario in Florence. This is the Indo-Africano Aquario, or Aquario Indo-Africano, in which you can see an unusual scene of exoticism. This really ties in well with the aesthetics of the 19th century and this love for exotic animals. I don't know how confident the director could be to just, you know, be at leisure with his crocodiles, but it's certainly a particularly unsettling image. And you can also see here the look and the elegance in the process. But there's something fascinating about these images and the way in which they capture events that could not be replicated today for a number of reasons involving health and safety limitations and other complications. It would be also impossible to keep quite as many alligators in the same enclosure as you see here. It's not quite clear how happy these animals must have been, but nonetheless, photography from the 19th century really delivers these unusual shots. And we're wrapping up today's quest for identity with an emphasis on the birth of the postcard. Postcards, remember them. Now, identity is a complex pursuit. We have seen today how in Italy, photography played an important role from the individual construction of identity, of characters as flamboyant, like the Countess of Castellione, to the rise of national identity, as we saw in the case of the Risorgimento. And one of the notions that I want you to entertain for a short while is the idea that prior to the event of TV, the expansion of the internet, the availability of images as we see them today so readily, constructing national identity was particularly complex. It was really in the hands of newspapers and books. And there's something fascinating about the circulation of images in the 19th century and how the photograph enables a process of dissemination that was, prior to the invention of photography, impossible because, of course, paintings were expensive. So the postcard represents this opportunity, not just for Italians who live in Italy to understand what their country looks like. Just imagine people going on holiday and sending a postcard with a picture and say, "Oh, I like this place. Maybe I'll go there next." You start sedimenting an archive in your mind of what Italy looks like. But you also begin with international postcards to build an archive of what places in Europe look like. So this is a way in which photography through the postcard begins to travel much more freely than books and newspapers across states and contributes to the rise of a European identity, which then becomes extremely shifty, shaky, and probably never really settles as European identity, something that we see the results of today, but that nonetheless contributed to making individuals aware of what is beautiful in other countries. So this is one of the very first postcards that was sent in 1869, a German invention. It was meant to be, initially, a faster and cheaper way to communicate very short messages. And then, of course, it grew into its own medium. And by the 1880s, we have illustrated postcards, as you can see here, one-sided. So on one side, you would have the illustration as well as the text. And on the other side, the address and the stamp. And then eventually, photography appearing on postcards just later on by the 1890s. And you can see here again how early postcards are trying to come to terms with this impossibility to organize space so that the image could be on one side, the text on the other, along with the address and the stamp, which was apparently the invention of the British. This is one of the early examples where you can still see the photograph sharing the side in which you write text. On that note, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture on the construction of identity through photography, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giovanni. Actually, there are two questions. One is Sandra is asking, how does the Countess of Castiglione compare to Lady Howarding?
In what case more specifically, we would have to ask?
How would you then elaborate?
I'm not sure. Is Sandra there and wants to say a little bit more?
Well, then while Sandra tries to elaborate the question, you can probably answer to the next one by Gwen. I'm extremely surprised to learn that photoshopping and retouching was possible in the 1800s. Can you provide any more details on how that was done?
I guess one of the interesting things about the retouching of the time is that it was in the hands of women, because it was considered to be a more delicate sort of approach to handiwork. So it bears this strange link with stitching and other work that requires precision. And there is documentation of how far it could go. And one of the things I really didn't have time to show is, for instance, repainting over photographs and then rephotographing photographs that have been substantially altered. So some of the images I showed you were just altered on the negative level and were printed at once. But if more substantial interaction was needed with the material to really modify it, one of the ways was to really heavily paint over it and then rephotograph it. And at that point, it was impossible to see any trace of manipulation on the surface of the photograph itself. So there are many different ways in which photography could be retouched more heavily or just, lightly, depending as well on how much money one wanted to pay. Because of course, the retouching of photographs came at an expense, at a cost.
Well, then I would like also to remind that actually how timely we are in selecting the dates for our talks, because Giovanni, you talked about the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And actually yesterday, March 17, right, we celebrated 160 years of the unification of Italy, and actually on the day of the proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy.
Yes, very
this
well. Yes, very well spotted. Absolutely, very timely. I don't think Sandra's coming back with.
No, apparently she's not.
Okay, well, all I can say, to me, they're different characters in many ways, because I think Harden was more of a kind of amateur photographer in terms of her relationship with the camera. I think the Countess of Castellione was more of a director, in a sense of the fact that, she always worked with Pearson behind the camera and she would stage everything. And also she was only interested in taking images of herself and posing herself, rather than also documenting others or documenting, her sons, which she could have done, but she never did, or documenting other people. It's all about her. The children that we see in the images are props. There were some children in the photographs. So that's as far as I can go.
Thank you, Giovanni. I would like also to invite everyone to visit the website of the Alinari archives. Actually, I put the address, the www.alinari.it, which is an interesting exploration of historical photographies, and not only. And then, as I thank Giovanni for this fantastic and enlightening lecture as usual, and very intriguing and stimulating, we'll see each other on April 15th for our third talk about photography. And in the meantime, thank you every one of you for attending, and have a good evening, and see you soon on these screens.
Thank you very much again. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Luca.